special occasion in which we bring two branches of the Methodist family into even closer connection, into an already existing relationship, and even more so. And as we also honor the 175th anniversary of Bethel Church. And so I want to congratulate those of you who are here from Bethel Church. This is, I recognize what an important occasion it is, having just celebrated our 150th anniversary as a theological school, as a theological seminary. And these are opportunities for us to mark in very tangible ways not only our connection to one another, but our service to our world, our service to the larger church. And so it is for that reason that I'm so glad that we've been able to assemble such a wonderful panel of people who are going to lead us in some conversation and some reflection. And I want to particularly welcome Bishop Gregory Ingram and Bishop John Scholl of the two local AME and United Methodist denominations to group. Bishop Scholl is very familiar as he chairs our theological school board, and Bishop Ingram, it's been wonderful to meet you, and I hope that this is but the beginning of a much more intentional relationship with you and the AME Church. And so with that in mind, I want to welcome my colleague who works across campus. I'm trying to think of it that way. The Reverend Dr. Fred Day, who serves as the General Secretary of the General Archives on Commission and History.
Good afternoon, everyone. I bring you greetings on behalf of the General Commission on Archives and History and the United Methodist Archives Center located here in Madison on the campus of United Methodist related Drew University, home to 35,000 volumes in print and microfilm, 10,000 pamphlets published by Methodist-affiliated traditions, 4,000 hymnals and hymn books, 2,000 Methodist-related periodicals, over 150 John Wesleyan family-related letters, 9,000 cubic feet of archival storage space, and more than 600,000 missionary photographs, which dramatically, in pictures worth 1,000 words, tell the church's story. We are absolutely delighted to welcome this event at the home of the Ministry of Memory of the United Methodist Church, and are particularly glad that Pastor Sidney Williams, on behalf of the Bethel AME Church in Morristown, thought to call GCAH and Drew University to be partners in celebrating this anniversary. And so, thank you, welcome, and Bishop Scholl, if you would come. Glad to have you all here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of Drew University, I welcome you here today to this important occasion. And also on behalf of the United Methodists here in Greater New Jersey, I welcome you to this important occasion. You know, here in New Jersey, we're rather proud that we're in the top 5 of most diverse states in the nation. We are the most urban state in the nation in terms of being the most densely populated state in our nation. And for United Methodists, we're blessed with all that diversity to have significant diversity within the United Methodist Church here. We have more than 100 cross-racial appointments. We have over 150 multicultural congregations. And on any given Sunday, 9 different languages are spoken in our churches. This is who New Jersey is, and we give thanks to God for that rich diversity. Today, I also want to give thanks and welcome my colleague, Bishop Gregory. I always want to say Gregory Palmer when I hear that name because he's a bishop in the United Methodist Church, but Gregory Ingram. And we just had a chance to meet for the very first time. Our paths haven't crossed before. He was consecrated a bishop in 2000. I was consecrated a bishop in 2004. I grew up in Philadelphia, but he came to Philadelphia after I had already left Philadelphia. So it's good to see you. We're all pretty glad you're here. I heard you were coming, so I got out of town. No, but you know, one of the great great things about the church, and particularly the Methodist family, the Wesleyan heritage, is that we really are family. And one of the things that I would never want to be in a gathering like this and remember, because history is so important for us to remember. We've got all of these pages in the archives, but we must remember that for we who are United Methodists, our history has been checkered at best in terms of race relations. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church really came about because of our own racism in the United Methodist Church. I'm glad in 2000, where we had the opportunity at our general conference to invite the Methodist family to come, in which we had a public service in which we repented for the sin that we had committed throughout our history. But I'm so glad that we're here together today. I'm so glad, Reverend Tyler, that you've helped to bring us together here today. Congratulate you on 175 years of ministry here in this area. So I'm not going to say anything more other than I want to invite Brandon Cho, who is the United Methodist pastor at Marstown, to come and did I say Tyler?
Yeah.
Tyler's in Philadelphia. I'm sorry. But I've just demoted him and promoted Reverend Williams. So he's still making mistakes. But I want to invite Brandon Cho, who's the United Methodist pastor here in this area, to come and lead us in prayer.
The name Tyler could be a prophetic word. I'm one of the 100 or so cross-cultural appointment pastors. I'm so glad to serve under Bishop Shaw, who has been my coach, my mentor, and my inspiration. So I'm grateful to you, Bishop, for your presence. Before I offer an invocation for today's gathering, Dr. Sidney Williams, who I love me for my brother, my partner in crime in this community, to share a little bit about what we are doing together as mission partners and God's co-workers to bring about transformational ministry in our community and our region here. I just named three things that have been happening in our partnership. One is a community-wide prayer walk and a prayer meeting in celebration of the Bethel AME's 175th anniversary. We also did this year again a joint Rainbow Vacation Bible School for all God's children in our community. And one great common denominator is all these children, Koreans and black kids and Hispanic kids and Anglo kids, they all love pizzas. And then we also had a community-wide conversation on race. And this was a very important defining conversation. And you have received, probably some of you have received a copy of the newsletter article that came out from our annual conference, and please take a look at that and see. I'm sharing these ministries and events as a way of encouraging us to go further beyond our celebration moment today, to get into more new tangible possibilities and opportunities to bring about collaborative work for the transformation of the world. That's what we are about. So I'd like to do that. With that note, I say, brothers and sisters, let us pray. God, our Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, there's a sweet, sweet Spirit in this place. And we know, Lord, that it is the Spirit of the Lord. There are sweet expressions on each face in this place. And we feel the presence of you. It is good to be in this sacred space of the Drew Forest. Thank you, Lord, for drawing us together as your people and as your servants. We're here to celebrate our union as heirs of John Wesley, to embrace our shared heritage and spirit of Methodism, and to recommit ourselves to the work of your reign for a time such as this. Today, O Lord, we celebrate and reaffirm the mission of the AME Church to minister to the social, spiritual, and physical development of all people.
and his vision to seek out and save the lost and to serve the needy, and his purpose to spread Christ's liberating gospel. Today, O Lord, we also celebrate and reaffirm the mission of the United Methodist Church, which is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Lord, united by our Methodist zeal and conviction, we dedicate our hearts and lives to your redemptive and hope-generating work in this world, changing lives and transforming communities. So we pray, O Lord, in our broken world, make us your healers and even wounded healers. In our divided world, make us your peacemakers and reconciling presence. In our unjust world, make us your justice-seeking people. In our hopeless world, make us your hope messengers and hope deliverers. In our tribalism-oriented world, make us your bridge builders among all of your people. In our loveless world, make us your agape people for nations. So as your beloved community, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned for God's people, we shall march on, forward and upward, to touch and transform each life in each community with your love power. So Lord, we pray, empower us to draw the circle of faith and of love wide and then wider. We praise you for our time together in Jesus' mighty and precious name. Amen.
Thank you to Brandon and to Bishop Scholl. In a moment you'll see how prophetic your statement was. 8 years ago, I was brought here from South Africa to serve the church here in Morristown, and I was fascinated by the wonderful history here in Morristown, and the more I learned, the more I studied. I wanted to find a way to celebrate this great history. And for my brothers and sisters from, or sons and daughters of Allen, you will know, there's one among us who loves history and who tells it well, and that's Reverend Mark Tyler. Reverend Mark Tyler sought him out and I said, what do I do to celebrate in a few years, 175th anniversary? And so Mark began to give me some instructions and some guideposts to follow. And so Bishop Scholl, you were right. Mark Tyler is the one that brought us together today. But Mark really set high benchmarks and said, this is what you got to do. And so I want to thank Fred Day for his leadership, and he and Mark were together and celebrated the history of St. George's and Mother Bethel. And I really try to follow that pattern with Brandon and Drew University to Kevin Miller. Thank you so much for your guidance here on campus. To Morris Davis, who's sitting in the back or standing in the back, made today possible. Morris, thank you for your leadership. To Dr. Willie Edwards, historian and scholar, who really kind of helped give shape to this idea of what it means to share space together. You should have received the flyer. We actually have a library exhibit at the Morristown Library for those of you in the area that tells the history of the African American community from the 1600s until this present age. And we titled that exhibit called The Ties That Bind, and we deal with how it tightens and loosens. And certainly Dr. Betty Adams, who we'll hear from later, sitting with these scholars, helping me understand Bethel's experience here in Morris County has not always been easy. It has not been a crystal stair. We surprised some people here in New Jersey, Bishop, hearing that they didn't know we had slaves in Morris County. They didn't know we had slaves in Morristown. But the daughter of a woman who was enslaved in Mendon gave birth to what's now Bethel AME Church in Morristown. This year, we finally put a tombstone on her grave. She died in 1912 after almost 100 years of living and never had a tombstone. And so this is a great celebration, and we're so glad to be here. I'm glad our bishop is here with us. But I've asked Reverend Mark Tyler, since he's been my mentor through this process, to come and introduce our bishop. Thank you. Mark, you come.
Thank you, Reverend Sidney Williams, for those kind words, and really proud of the work that you're doing here and the collaboration outside of your own church walls. Certainly to all of you thank you, Bishop Scholl. I don't argue with bishops, so whatever you say goes. If you're a bishop, you're going to work it out. I'm just glad to be here to see this wonderful experience of theological education and the church coming together is a wonderful opportunity. I'm here to present Bishop Ingram, and I think I have a couple of slides that I wanted to do. Bishop Ingram, for those who do not know, serves as the Bishop of the 1st District, which is the Northeast Corridor, comprising the New England states, New York, Bermuda, Delaware, Eastern Pennsylvania, and of course, New Jersey. He's also the chairman of the board of directors at Payne Theological Seminary, the oldest AME higher education institution in Wilberforce, Ohio. Now, Cindy, you say I love history, but I don't know anyone who loves history as much as our own bishop. And I mean, he is really going to leave an impression on the AME Church, the city of Philadelphia, and just beyond in the work that he has done. He served as the host, bishop for the 50th General Conference of the AME Church, our bicentennial in 2016, and he's currently completing the Encyclopedia of African Methodism. This is the 3rd edition, the first in 1916, the second in 1947-48. And I've been watching him go through the rough drafts, driving up here today, just watching him again, adding and correcting. And so I said, what better way to introduce him than to show his work? The song says, "Let the work I've done speak for me." This is a mural that was done under Bishop Ingram's direction along with Philadelphia's Mural Arts Program. It is on the side of the 3801 Market Street AME Church 1st District headquarters. That's actually about 3 stories high. And from Market Street, 38th Street, you'll see it. It's a beautiful tribute to Bishop Richard Allen, our founder. And the very first, I mean, this is incredible because Mural Arts is an internationally renowned program, but this is the very first mural in their collection of Bishop Richard Allen, an oversight that they acknowledged. And but again, this is the work of our own Bishop Ingram. Can we give it a hand? And the next slide is the fulfillment of a dream that started over 100 years ago. I think Bishop J. Bass Campbell's first brought it up in the 1800s. There was a serious attempt in the 1940s. And when Bishop Ingram arrived in our district in 2012, said he wanted to see this happen, worked with the trustees at Mother Bethel, and this is now in the corner of 6th and Lombard, the very first public statue of Bishop Richard Allen, not just in Philly, but anywhere in the world that we know of. So again, this is all done by Bishop Ingram. So I present to you the person who loves history more than anybody I know, Bishop Gregory G.M. Ingram. Come on, let's say amen.
Thank Dr. Tyler. I wish my wife was here so she could hear all those wonderful things you said. To His Eminence Bishop Scholl, to the Dean Javier, to Fred, to the distinguished presiding elders, and some of our pastors and people who are here from the 1st District, I'm going to ask them just to stand for a second. I'm doing that. I'm doing it because I was taking attendance. You know, a minute ago, it was Reverend Cho, did I pronounce that right? Now, you made me hungry talking about pizzas and everything. But really, in a very real sense, you said something that kind of triggered a thought to me. One is that this is a kind of an eschatological hope to this extent. The dynamic, Bishop, is that all's peace that we all may be one. And really we are one. We're one in faith, we're one in a part of our tradition, and we're one in the spirit. And the real goal, the ultimate goal should be that not only today, but tomorrow and together. That's really what God wants us to be. And I think that when I come in here and I'm going to say something about this brilliant man we have here today. I'm familiar with the Methodist Church. Really, I came out of a good Methodist school, 2 of them. And I always want to give a plug to my seminary, Garrett. Garrett Theological Seminary. Wonderful experience. And when I look around and feel a certain presence, I can feel part of Gary here and part of you all. You all honor us today, and I want to say to one of our pastors, Reverend Sidney, thank you, sir, for having this sensitivity, and thank you for your vision that brings people together. The shared part of this history. It says, brothers and sisters, that history is a unique phenomenon. History is his story. Mystery is our story, my story. It's really what we're doing together. It really builds and kind of bridges and brings a lot of things together. Dr. Tyler, a minute ago, talked about some of the things we're doing. And to my right person, I said I'll say something about. But the last encyclopedia, I think Dr. Sidney, you were talking about this. Last encyclopedia was done in 1947-48 by Bishop R.R. Wright. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working on this document. It's going to exceed 830 some odd pages. It includes an awful lot. Bios of a lot of all the bishops and the supervisors, distinguished AMEs, history about all our colleges, universities, seminaries. It gives information about all of our organizations and commissions, and it really tells the story of an awful lot. Now this is just a semblance of it. I've been looking at it because I've been trying to do a reading and a rereading and looking at some of the mistakes, and I saw a glaring one coming up here with Reverend Mark. One of our bishops was married and his wife died, and then they say about the second wife, who's living. That was Bishop Pratt. And if I print this and without having her name in here, I was going to be, well, they were going to excommunicate me. They was going to be out. So I'm glad that Sidney and some other people have challenged me about this. One of the things that makes it all interesting for me, brothers and sisters, as we come, and I made reference to this wonderful mind that you might have here today. Dr. Dennis Dickinson, who's really been a great inspiration, not only to me, but people throughout the AME Church. He is very humble, and he really does, the reason why God didn't make our arms long enough so we won't be patting ourselves on the back too much. I want to pat him on the back because of the things he's done. He has a wonderful insertion here, about 12 pages about the AME Church. And I would say to you, Dean Javier, that when this book is completed, I want to make sure you all get a copy, put in your, Fred, make sure you put this in there. Because it's an awful lot of work about the church and about many of us. One of the things I say to young people now is that they may believe that everything started with them. The beginning point is that when you look at the historical significance of our people, particularly the ABCs, the antecedents to behavior and consequences, many things that happen now, people don't have a real appreciation. And so I'm excited as a student to come here and listen to Dr. Dennis Dickinson and to hear what this is a wonderful institution. I'm inspired by coming on the campus here at Drew. And while I serve as the chairperson for PAIN, if one or two of my pastors are interested in coming to school and they can't get the PAIN, I'm going to suggest that they come over here and Drew. Under some other, I'm going to say something about that later. Finally, let me say this, that really I think this is an idea whose time has come. In many instances, we are estranged and we are separated. We have so many things in common. And until we have, Bishop, opportunity to sit down and dialogue, to see the various backgrounds and historical contexts in which we come from, we'd be surprised exactly what God has done in our midst. And so this is a great day. Sidney, excuse me, Dr. Sidney, he just got his doctorate, so I want to make sure that I call him doctor. I want to say to you, sir, thank you again for having this sensitivity. I'm not going to say too much about our book. I'll make sure you get a copy and see where the Lord has brought us from. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Kevin. This is one of our pastors. And the reason why I'm going to bring some other students, because you're going to help us with some of the things we're doing, right? Hello? Okay. Thank God.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Lily Johnson Edwards, Professor Emerita of History and African American Studies at Drew University. I'd like to thank all my Drew colleagues and especially Reverend Dr. Williams for the honor of participating in this panel, but also in all of the 2018 events celebrating Bethel's 175th anniversary. And although Reverend Drew didn't mention it, I'm part of that partner in crime piece. Although we've been working on the anniversary events for about a year, and Reverend Dr. Williams has my CV and resume, of course, and maybe my Drew colleagues maybe said a good word about me at some point to him, I felt obliged to send him one more credential just 2 months ago or so. I sent him a copy of my 1954 baptism certificate from Ward Chapel AME Church in Columbus, Georgia, just to make sure he understood just how certified I was to work on this anniversary. So that certificate of baptism, returning to Drew's campus, and my membership in the United Methodist Church under Bishop Scholl makes this an especially honored place, a space that I can call home in so many ways. This type of convergence of the history of Methodism, the overlapping histories of the AME Church, the United Methodist Church, Bethel's history, the history of Morristown, the history of Morris County, and also New Jersey state history reflects the ways that this anniversary has been conceived as so much more than the anniversary of a single church. Rather, Bethel has conceived of its singular history as a communal experience that honors the past, affirms the present, and anticipates the future. The lecture we will hear provides us with another important occasion to see Bethel and Black churchhood as the center of a communal spiritual life that takes the church into the world in ways that must challenge and confront and reject efforts to demean and dehumanize Blackness. Today we have two scholars who will help us connect the history of Bethel to the broader history of the AME Church, and especially the AME Church in New Jersey. I am honored then to introduce to you first Dr. Betty Livingston Adams, who will serve as the respondent for the keynote lecture. Dr. Adams' scholarship and academic teaching explore 19th and 20th century African American and American religious and social history. Dr. Adams holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale University and a Master of Divinity from Drew. She received numerous fellowships, including the Rutgers University's postdoctoral fellowship in race and gender history, a Ford Foundation doctoral fellowship, and several prizes from Drew Seminary. She has served on the faculty of Rutgers University Department of History and the Institute for Research on Women, and as a fellow at the Yale Initiative for the Study of Material and Visual Culture. Published in several academic journals, having spoken nationwide at academic conferences and to public audiences, and as a member of several academic organizations, Dr. Adams is especially known for her seminal work, Black Women's Christian Activism, Seeking Social Justice in a Northern Suburb. If you don't have your copy already, you can purchase one while you are here. Today's lecturer, Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson, the James M. Lawson Jr. Professor of History at Vanderbilt University, is one of the most prolific and well-known scholars of AME history. Before coming to Vanderbilt, Dr. Dickerson taught at Williams College, Rhodes College, Yale Divinity School, and Payne Theological Seminary. He specializes in American labor history, the history of the United States Civil Rights Movement, African American religious history, the social history of American medicine, and Wesleyan studies. Among his many publications are Out of the Crucible, Black Steelworkers in Western Pennsylvania, African American Preachers and Politics, The Carries of Chicago, which I believe we also have copies of that particular book here today for you. Militant Mediator, Whitney M. Young Jr. He has received grants and fellowships from the American Academy in Berlin, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He served as president of the American Society of Church History and is a member of the editorial board of Wesley and Methodist Studies. He served as historiographer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and in this capacity he wrote Religion, Race, and Region Research Notes on AME Church History, A Liberated Past, Explorations in the AME Church, African Methodism and its Wesleyan Heritage, Reflections on AME Church History. And I hope you do realize this is an excerpt of some of the things he has written, not all of them. He has presented at the Oxford Institute of Methodist Theological Studies and has published articles on American religion and Methodism and civil rights in several edited works. We can all look forward to reading his forthcoming books, Brother in the Spirit of Gandhi, William Stewart Nelson and Religious Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, and also a short history of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is currently under contract to Cambridge University Press. I know you're all very excited, as I am, to hear our plenary lecturer, Dr. Dickerson.
Say something about almost everybody who is here, because our friendships and associations have gone back a long way. I just want to single out Bishop Ingram, who's been my bishop, and he's my friend, and he's a good man, and I appreciate the sensitivity and sensibility he has about the importance of the church past and his connection to our present ministry. I appreciate that. Bishop Ingram, appreciate that also, and Bishop Scholl. And also to my scholarly colleagues, Dr. Maury Davis, and to Russ Ritchie, who is seated here, a renowned Methodist historian. We go back in a number of different venues. Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards, for that very kind introduction. I want to say something before I start the lecture, that Bishop Ingram, you know this, that the AME Church has had a long history with Drew University, with the Drew University Theological School. Our revered Bishop Decatur Ward Nichols, the 59th elected and consecrated bishop of the AME Church, was a graduate of the seminary in 1923 and stayed over for an extra year to take a master's degree in missions. And even before that, the class of 1908 of bishops, Bishop Park, Bishop Hurd, Bishop Flipper, started a scholarship for AME students to come to Drew. Maury and I were talking over lunch that we wanted the dean to look into your records, because there's some AME money here. And I was talking specifically about the interest that is been drawn since 1908. So, Bishop Ingram, you have a real interest in making that inquiry to see if that AME money is still operative and whether that is available to us to support future seminarians. Thank you very much. I want to talk about what I think are what I like to suggest are the thematic components of AME Church history, not only as a way of understanding the past, but to look quite specifically on how these themes, how these recurring themes, how these salient themes still impact how the church envisages itself and identifies itself and points some way to contemporary ministry. Slide, please. In 1903, W.B. Du Bois, hardly a denominational partisan, described the great African Methodist Church as the greatest Negro organization in the world. Only the National Baptist Convention, recently organized in 1896, exceeded the 500,000 membership that the AMEs claimed. But the Baptists, an aggregation of autonomous state conventions and local congregations, lacked the hierarchical structure of this Black Methodist body. The AME's bishops, presiding elders, pastors, and many other officials forged a cohesive infrastructure that proved to doubtful whites that African Americans were fully capable of effective self-governance. In addition to Du Bois's praise for the institutional achievements of the AME Church, he was especially impressed with its longevity. Already a century old at the time of Du Bois's comments, African Methodists had become a venerable religious body with bishops who were among the most powerful Negro rulers in the world. In 2004, Gabriel S. Wilmore, a Presbyterian and an African American religious intellectual, confirmed Du Bois's description of the AME Church and called it America's premier predominantly Black denomination. Just as African Methodism drew Du Bois's and Wilmore's admiration, other scholars discovered crucial liberation themes in the AME narrative, which explained, defined, and reflected the discourse and strategies that African Americans pursued to attain their freedom. Horace Van Vaughan, for example, credited the church with making no compromise with the essential idea of human liberty, and for inspiring President Abraham Lincoln to insert this ideal into the Emancipation Proclamation. Eddie S. Law showed how the Exodus theme shaped Black political discourse and viewed AME founder Richard Allen's exit from Philadelphia's St. George Church in 1787 as a reenactment of Moses and his followers' epic departure from slavery in Egypt. Allen's act defied the racism of Wesleyan whites and led to the rise of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and other independent Black congregations. Just as Moses led ancient Hebrews to their promised land in Canaan, the St. George incident was replicated in other episodes of the African American experience and became a metaphor for ongoing efforts to find safe havens for the enslaved and oppressed. For denominational adherents, the perspectives of Du Bois, Bond, and Law echo their own view that African Methodism embodied an emancipatory ethos that Blacks throughout the diaspora embraced and emulated. George A. Singleton, a prolific AME scholar, observed that the very idea of former slaves resenting social injustice to the extent that they break away with the old organization is startling. In Allen's philosophy, he declared, there is no room for color discrimination or segregation, and that explained their separation from white Methodists. The AME founder, Singleton noted, rose above caste and proscription and sought liberation for the Black population. Charles H. Wesley, an AME historian, added Richard Allen regarded the Negro people as an oppressed minority who needed an aggressive leadership to achieve its emancipation. The AME Church, Wesley declared, was Allen's vehicle to realize this objective. Hence, as the denomination grew and the organization was strengthened, the march toward Black liberation gained momentum. When planning expansion in Maryland, a slave state, Allen hoped that the example of free Negroes who had their own preachers and churches would have the effect of keeping slaves dissatisfied with their condition. That was precisely the point that Allen aimed to articulate.
He clearly envisaged African Methodism as a part of a freedom movement to liberate slaves and secure black freedom throughout the Atlantic world. Just as the Black Atlantic defined the mission and ministry of African Methodism, its anchoring in Wesleyan theology also reinforced its emancipationist ethos. As a freedom church, AME's developed as a different denomination from what whites in the AME Church established at the 1784 Christmas Conference. Far more than their Caucasian counterparts, AMEs adhered to John Wesley's unyielding opposition to slavery and found within his practical theology a moral warrant to challenge sinful societal structures that sustained and perpetuated racial oppression. AMEs understood that personal renewal or scriptural holiness experienced through the salvific process of sanctification and perfectionism extended into and required replication in all of creation. And saved and sanctified Methodists should practice social holiness and serve as a leaven to perfect society away from slavery and other forms of human subjugation. Commitments to these theological tenets enabled Richard Allen, Daniel Coker, and other AME founders during the lifetime of John Wesley to develop an alternative version of American-based Methodism that was truer to the founders' intentions than what Wesleyan whites envisaged. The origins of the African Methodist Episcopal Church lay in the Atlantic world context, in which diverse African peoples populated the ministry and membership of this emerging Wesleyan body. African Methodism, developing in Philadelphia out of the Free African Society in 1787, through Bethel Church in 1794, and as a denominational body in 1816, exemplified black self-determination, which shaped its identity and praxis as a freedom church. The denomination pursued liberationist activities on both sides of the Atlantic for marginalized peoples through church expansion into racially hostile settings and a strong opposition to slavery, segregation, and colonialism. This emancipationist ethos, however, matured through succeeding centuries in dynamic tension with the necessities and requirements of institutionalization. Through formal structures strengthened AME capacities to protect and protest in behalf of its black diaspora constituency, these same systems and their insatiable but justifiable appetite for institutional growth and preservation rivaled and at times undermined the church's ingrained insurgent impulses. Daniel A. Payne, an early bishop, used these competing tendencies as complementary facets of his denomination's emancipationist ethos. Next slide, please. At the same time, he thought that the fight against oppression, while dangerous, drew far more applause than founding churches and schools and expanding them into unfriendly territories. He fervently believed that his institutional activities fulfilled liberationist objectives that would sustain African Americans in their hard-won freedoms. Earlier in his ministry, however, he faced a choice of building a denominational aegis for blacks or joining the abolitionist movement to achieve their release from slavery. Lewis Tappan and other colleagues in the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, after hearing Payne preach in 1837, asked him to be a full-time lecturer at a generous annual salary of $300. Here was an inducement, Payne said, to an inviting field, yet one as laborious and dangerous as it was flattering to the pride and ambition of a young man like himself. He added that heroism and consequent fame offered their laurels to any young man of talent and intelligence who might be willing to become the fearless and successful opponent of American slavery and the eloquent defender of liberty and human rights. After a few years as a Presbyterian pastor, Payne transferred to the AME Church in 1841, was elected historiographer in 1848, and was consecrated as a bishop in 1852. Already a crusader for an educated ministry, the impecunious bishop purchased Wilberforce University in 1863 on a pledge of $10,000, and then launched a mission to newly freed slaves in the former Confederacy in 1865. The development of African Methodism and its infrastructure, rather than abolitionists and civil rights activism, claimed the entirety of Payne's energies. Though each endeavor aimed at black liberation, Payne believed that his AME activities were foundational to other freedom initiatives in education, moral reform, and equal rights. African Methodism was itself a bulwark against the degradation of blacks. Therefore, he declared that when the institution of slavery was striking its root deep into the American state and the spirit of caste building, its nest in the bosom of the American church, the origin of the African AME Church was necessitated. Payne offered an apologia for his vocational decision by comparing himself to his contemporary Frederick Douglass, the celebrated abolitionist and black equal rights champion. Douglass, who had been affiliated with Baltimore's Bethel AME Church, escaped from slavery in 1838 and became an AME Zion preacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Like Payne, white abolitionists heard him speak and immediately drafted the willing ex-slave into the abolitionist cause. Payne believed, however, that he and Douglass were divinely assigned to their respective roles in the black freedom struggle. Frederick Douglass, he declared, was fitted for his specialty, Daniel Payne for his. Frederick Douglass could not do the work that was assigned to Daniel Alexander Payne, or Daniel Alexander Payne the work assigned to Frederick Douglass. Du Bois agreed that Douglass and Payne, though different, both embodied a liberationist persona. Douglass, Du Bois said, was the greatest of American Negro leaders, but Payne was less conspicuous, but of greater social significance. Henry M. Turner, himself a leading black spokesman, Reconstruction politician, and AME bishop, recognized the dual spheres in which Payne and Douglass operated. When Douglass visited the 1884 General Conference in Baltimore, Turner declared that as Frederick Douglass was the greatest colored statesman in the world, and as Bishop Payne is the greatest colored theologian, he would ask Bishop Payne to present Douglass to the AME audience. Payne, in a very able and graceful manner, introduced Mr. Douglass as the great statesman and advocate of freedom. Douglass, in turn, acknowledged the influence and significance of the church. Great is the press and great is the ballot, he declared, but still greater is the pulpit. This nod to Payne validated the bishop's institutional labors as integral to African American advancement as much as his own involvements in politics and protests. Payne and Douglass, in different but complementary arenas, authenticated each other as frontline leaders in the black freedom struggle. Payne envisaged the expansion of African Methodism as an affront to slavery and as a blow for freedom. Hence, those who undertook institutional tasks were obligated to relate them to emancipationist objectives. During Reconstruction, certain AME preachers did just that and became clergy politicians. In this regard, next slide please, Richard H. Kane and others like him exposed Payne to both the lofty goals and the unpleasant practices of politics. On the one hand, the bishop believed that when a Christian approaches the poll, he is morally bound to cast his vote for no one but an open and fearless advocate of liberty, justice, and all righteousness. Therefore, in all the reconstructed southern states, our church is proportionately represented by AME ministers in various legislatures and public offices. For these reasons, Payne endorsed their efforts to safeguard black civil rights and implement the freedom ethos of African Methodism. But Payne, on the other hand, criticized Kane and some others for bringing secular political methods into AME elections. He said these activities compromised their usefulness and integrity. Payne was loath to admit that Kane and other clergy politicians like him legitimately embodied the denomination's liberationist legacy, even as they practiced the sometimes unsavory methods of politics. Historian Reginald F. Hildebrand has described Kane as a proponent of the gospel of freedom. He built Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, into a congregation of 3,000 and parlayed his pastoral popularity into votes for public office. As a local official and later as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Kane believed that his congregation and community were well served through his dual roles in the pulpit and in the public square. Payne, though recognizing the value of Kane's public role, retreated from his earlier approval and disparaged him as a mere political operative. Despite this intended slur, Kane, who also became a bishop, included himself in the same AME liberationist tradition that Payne extolled. Next slide, please. Less visible AMEs but certainly more numerous in their better-known colleagues, pursued liberationist objectives in innumerable locales. In Woodbury, New Jersey, located in a region with some of the founding congregations in African Methodism, a local preacher and laborer provided material aid to the Union Army during the Civil War. Henry Dickerson, absolutely no relation to me. Born in Maryland in 1794, leased some of his Woodbury land in 1862 as a training camp for the Union Army at Camp Stockton. There, the 12th Regiment of the New Jersey Volunteer Infantry prepared for service to save the Union and to end slavery. He and Sophia Dickerson were parents to 8 children, one of whom, William Fisher Dickerson, born in Woodbury in 1844, was elected an AME bishop in 1880. Hence, we discovered that the crucial issue facing AMEs, including Allen, Payne, Kane, Henry Dickerson, and their posterity, was how the liberationist rhetoric and praxis of the denomination met the inexorable and multiple challenges of history, the abolitionist movement, Civil War, Reconstruction, industrialization, urbanization, gender equity, colonialism, globalization, and other transformative events and phenomena. Despite a tight structure, disciplined polity, and a prominent institutional profile, the AME Church was neither uniformly influential nor determinative on many challenges that confronted the communicants and communities it served. Additionally, members of the AME Church, notwithstanding an ironclad commitment to its mission for freedom, constantly had to rethink and re-articulate their Wesleyan theology and reassess their grounding in African and African-American folk religion. Each contained theological tenets and liberationist principles which required a vigorous social witness and incubated cultural idioms that affirmed the humanity of blacks. African Methodists blended these theological traditions and drew from them resources to critique and resist powerful social, economic, and political forces which had enslaved and subordinated them. Next slide. Serious successors to Richard Allen, who explicitly linked their activism to the AME founder, especially in the 20th century, included A. Philip Randolph, the pioneer labor leader and advocate of nonviolent grassroots mobilization, Rosa Parks, the progenitor of the Montgomery bus boycott, and J. A. Delane, the sponsor of a foundational case in South Carolina that led to the Supreme Court's landmark public desegregation decision in 1954. These individuals, both clergy and lay, emulated Allen's emancipationist efforts even as denominational leaders more concerned with institutional affairs focused their support on liberationist objectives mainly through celebratory and hagiographical rhetoric. Though institutional development and preservation, themselves acts of self-determination, increasingly preoccupied the AME hierarchy over 2 centuries, Allenite activism attracted the commitment of other rank-and-file ministers and members. Embedded within these phenomena were tensions between those who emphasize organizational governance and those who argue for a greater focus on social insurgency, often at the expense of governance. Hence, Parks, Randolph, and Delane, more than their denominational superiors, became energetic and authentic carriers of their church's emancipationist ethos. Sustaining the balance between denominational involvement and liberationist activities existed in the AME institutional life and within the hearts and minds of individuals. There were many ministers and members who embodied inside of them these warring selves, and the battleground on which these tensions were addressed and resolved lay in the realm of lived religion. Hymnody, especially in the familiar lyrics of Wesleyan compositions and black spirituals, show the direct link between the pursuit of spiritual and temporal freedom. Did the search for salvation culminate in personal piety and perfectionism, or did it also extend to practical divinity and the pursuit of the new creation embodied within Wesleyan theology? How did lived religion, as informed by black folk practices in culture, worship, music, biblical hermeneutics, ecstatic expressions of spirituality, steer the clergy and laity toward the sacred task of institutional maintenance and the sacred duty of spearheading societal transformation? How did AMEs understand and define ecclesiology? In what ways did it influence how their faith was lived out in devotional practices, denominational engagement and social activism, and what emancipationist themes already intrinsic to black folk religion spurred AME activism. Did these tendencies in the lived religion of African Methodists over 2 centuries cause the clergy and laity to draw from their black religious experience blended commitments to liberationist practice and personal piety? Here are the contributions of Cecil W. Cone, a theologian of AME heritage in the identity crisis in black theology, and Dale P. Andrews, a scholar in the AME Zion tradition in practical theology for black churches, are especially suggestive. Cone contended that black theologians and other scholars should historicize and construct black theology upon the foundations of the black religious tradition. Black theology for Cone was inauthentic unless black religion defined it. That included idioms drawn from the indigenous African American background and adopted Euro-American doctrine and discipline. Emancipationist efforts are a part of black religion and are therefore the salient concern in black religion and theology. In a similar vein, Andrews was concerned with theological tasks that emancipationist scholars undertake and how they often misconstrue issues of faith, worship, and spirituality, which are crucially important to pastors and parishioners. The self-images of black churches, he argued, involves a caring community that cultivates both spiritual and social liberation. Scholars sometimes fail to appreciate these dualities of discourse within black religious communities, especially in historical context. Andrews observed that faith identity is core to African American religion. He contended the domain of faith identity nurtures black personhood and embraces a sense of peoplehood in God. In turn, shaping black ecclesiology and the paradigm of faith identity offers a platform for readdressing black theology to black churches. This gulf between black liberationist scholars and black church ministers and members can be bridged if the black folk religion and its concerns with preaching, pastoral care, and spirituality can inform how liberation is functioning in black religious folk life and how it sustained emancipationist activities. Historian Douglas Brinkley, in his biography of Rosa Parks, confirms the observations of Cone and Andrews. Parks, he contended, embodied social holiness linked to her devotional life at St. Paul AME Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Moreover, Parks' defiance of sinful segregationist practices on local city buses reflected devotional practices developed out of her experiences in private and public worship and her understanding of herself as a 20th century heir to Richard Allen. Parks, a stewardess who helped to prepare the Eucharist at her Montgomery church, also believed that memorializing Jesus' sacrifice to conquer sin required the same demonstration of selflessness against the injustices of racism. Beyond her historical act in inspiring a Montgomery bus boycott, Brinkley challenged historians to probe the interior of Parks' lived religion as an AME and uncover how it connected to her social activism. Brinkley insightfully explored Parks' piety, spirituality, and devotional practices and tied them to social holiness. Robert Thomas Jr., an activist AME pastor in Chicago and later Parks' bishop in Detroit, anticipated Brinkley's scholarship when he petitioned the 2000 AME General Conference to beautify this civil rights pioneer. Hence, Thomas petitioned the denominational body to insert in the doctrine and discipline of the African Methodist Episcopal Church the name of Sister Rosa Parks in the consecration collect for church deaconesses, an office reserved for holy women within African Methodism. Hence, Parks' name appears on the roster of Christian matriarchs along with Deborah, Mary, the Holy Mother, Phoebe, and Lydia as among those who give themselves entirely to the ministrations of the church and to suffering humanity. Hence, Parks exemplified personal renewal experienced through the Eucharist and holy living as culminating in societal transformation through her fight against segregation. Although Parks and other AME women embodied the denomination's freedom rhetoric and praxis, they still experienced gender discrimination, especially in the matter of female ordination. From Richard Allen's reluctance to authorize Carmina Lee to preach in 1809, to the overdue election of the first female bishop, Vashti Murphy McKenzie in 2000, AME seldom saw gender inequality as a serious flaw in their liberationist identity. Despite a mostly male monopoly on influential leadership positions, women established themselves as productive pastors and parishioners who aided AME development, sometimes through derivative authority flowing from their marriage to bishops and other high church officials, and at other times through female auxiliaries. AME women pursued liberationist objectives through their activities in education and missions and through womanist interpretations of Scripture. As a result, they became crucial carriers of the church's emancipationist ethos, often exceeding the majority of males who were mainly involved in governance. Hence, Tarina Lee married the AME emphasis on Wesleyan piety and perfectionism with support for the abolitionist movement. Sarah Allen, a participant on the Underground Railroad, sustained fugitive slaves as they escaped from bondage. Next slide, please. Charlotte Monnier and Europa Randall spearheaded AME expansion in Africa. Sadie T.M. Alexander vigorously pressed for civil rights as a presidential appointee during the Truman administration. And Gloria White Hammond recovered the denomination's abolitionist legacy and aimed it against 21st century slavery and genocide in Darfur, Sudan. These and countless other women routinely drew from insurgent impulses ingrained in the AME ethos. Notwithstanding the barriers of gender, they cited as models such biblical women as Deborah, Esther, and Mary Magdalene, and adopted as their own narrative the rhetoric and celebration of the autonomy which Allen's exit from St. George Church symbolized. These influential examples established them as authoritative interpreters and practitioners of the AME liberationist heritage. Ethnicity inserted into African Methodism a diversity of language, rituals, and idioms drawn from the broad geographic span of the Atlantic world. Despite these differences, AME leaders required the denomination to emancipate diverse black populations, whether in the slave and segregated American South, in the colonial Caribbean, or in apartheid South Africa. This ambitious Pan-Africanism, however, did not remove the tensions between forces compelling church officials to focus on institutional business and a countervailing challenge to confront hegemonic structures which subordinated peoples of African descent. As AMEs pushed expansion outside of the United States, these divergent tendencies initially coalesced. Institutional development was articulated and pursued as a liberationist thrust. When the denomination, for example, organized its Canadian congregations in 1856 as the British Methodist Episcopal Church, the new religious body pledged to protect the freedoms of blacks throughout the British Empire and to provide a haven for fugitive slaves escaping bondage in the United States. Similarly, when the United States merged in 1896 with South Africa's Ethiopian Church, their embrace of black self-determination attracted followers opposed to white dominance in both political and ecclesiastical spheres. However, as the denomination settled into a stable presence, then conflicts between institutional maintenance and insurgent activities reemerged. After the Nationalist Party won control in 1948, for example, apartheid policies were rapidly enacted and enforced. When the AME General Conference in 1948 assigned an Alabama-born bishop to preside in the region, he promised non-interference with the government's segregation of schools. In return for this acquiescence, the bishop was allowed into the country to supervise AME annual conferences and schools. Presiding elders in South Africa in 1949 assured authorities that the bishop's work was ecclesiastical and not political. Unlike Allen and Payne, who while tending to denominational duties continued forthright opposition to racism, several 20th century bishops seemed compelled to choose between institutional and insurgent activities. Hence the AME liberationist posture, though at times pursued surreptitiously, generally lost its edge against an openly racist regime. The denomination's liberationist legacy, though still acknowledged and celebrated, was deprived, at least for a time, of an effective practice to fight apartheid. Once the momentum of a broader grassroots movement against apartheid reached fruition in the 1980s and early 1990s, AMEs ultimately, and perhaps belatedly, stood with South Africans in their successful effort to destroy state-sponsored racial oppression. Conflicts about Western cultural influences also lessened the denomination's emancipationist energies. These disagreements mostly focus on the ecstatic and exuberant religious practices of ex-slave Southerners, or the religious idioms of indigenous Africans. Educated clergy and missionaries, however, emphasize dignified worship, Orthodox Christian beliefs, and the elimination of egregious traces of the African religious background. The exercise of these preferences, especially in areas outside of the United States, motivated AME expansionists, at least initially, to identify with Creole populations, particularly in Africa. Hence, the AMEs had their earliest success in the 1890s among descendants of repatriated settlers in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and among the Cape Coloreds in South Africa. In Liberia, for example, these Creole settlers, known as American Liberians, denigrated indigenous peoples and eschewed power sharing with them in both church and civic arenas. Though the church's emancipationist ethos resonated within these populations, their sense of cultural superiority over indigenous peoples made them less enthusiastic about equal ecclesiastical treatment toward their social inferiors. Therefore, Western cultural attitudes and actions sometimes undermined the cohesion of AME ministers and members, and often prevented their freedom rhetoric from transcending these differences. AMEs easily interacted with westernized Africans who, like themselves, exhibited the blended attributes of Christianity and civilization. Next slide. AME clergyman William H. Hurd, minister resident and consul general of the United States to Liberia, and later a bishop, wrote in his 1898 book, The Bright Side of African Life, that he found these characteristics within the ruling elite of this West African nation. He lavishly praised Liberia, established as a republic in 1847, for emulating the government structure of its patron, the United States of America, and having as its officialdom exemplary officers of African American free and slave descent. Liberia, he said, is struggling to maintain its existence and to hold up the light of Christianity to its own people. The American Liberians, he added, influenced thousands of the Aborigines to adopt Christianity and civilization, and today they are clothed and in their right minds and enjoying Christianity. Moreover, Liberia, a model black republic, reflected how Hurd envisaged AME Pan-Africanism and its emphasis on black self-determination. Like Liberia, the AME Church, president of the country since the 1880s, was a race church, and it is the composition of the church that makes it take in Africa. Not only at its head are Negroes, but they were Christian and civilized peoples who wanted the same for the indigenous population. Alfred L. Ridgell, an Arkansas native whom Hurd commended for his ministry in advancing African Methodism in Liberia, held a similar definition of AME Pan-Africanism and its special role in developing the mother continent. He regretted that AMEs and other black religious bodies have not, as a whole, realized our heaven-imposed duties to Africa, and should therefore welcome white denominations to share with them responsibilities for Christianization and civilization in Africa. Nonetheless, the people of Africa prefer our church government to that of other churches here. They regard our polity more in keeping with genuine Christianity and better suited for people just emerging from heathenism. Africans, he said in his 1896 publication, Africa and African Methodism, they like the Methodist fire, which provides consolation to the soul and can be touched by gospel magnetism. Therefore, the African approves of African Methodism. Lifting Africans from primitivism through AME evangelism was this consensus that Hurd, Rigel, and other denominational leaders espoused. These stubborn prejudices which informed AME Pan-Africanism were foundational to AME interaction with indigenous peoples in Africa. African Methodism, based in the United States, functioned as a conduit for African modernization done through Christianity and the adoption of Western education. This version of AME Pan-Africanism that African Americans defined yielded to independence movements after World War II that asserted and achieved African self-determination in state matters and formally white-led missionary and ecclesiastical bodies. Though AMEs embraced the anti-colonialism of African ministers and members, the denomination was slow to apply this same advocacy to their denominational governments. not until Africans redefined Pan-Africanism as denoting full access to the episcopacy did indigenization become integral to AME operations. Historian Lori Mayfield correctly contends that black religious bodies, despite a shared religious heritage, possess a sharply defined denominational consciousness. The AME Church, with its history, hagiography, and celebration of itself, embodies a particular consciousness whose core characteristic lay in its freedom, rhetoric, and praxis, because the very existence of the AME Church symbolized racial autonomy and self-determination. Its maintenance and preservation became a liberationist enterprise. Additionally, those who developed the denomination had an equal obligation to mobilize its resources to fight societal structures that subordinated black peoples. These emancipationist efforts, while creating a distinctive AME culture, also place organizational and insurgent objectives in constant tension with each other. Though other black churches fought for black freedom, none had embedded in their history an Exodus narrative reenacted as powerfully as Richard Allen's dramatic departure from a white-dominated church determined to segregate its black members. Additionally, AMEs expressed their emancipationist ethos through scriptural interpretations, often sung in slave spirituals and black hymnody, and freedom objectives embedded in Wesleyan social holiness. These intellectual resources provided AMEs with a cogent liberationist theology and praxis, and a keen awareness of their insurgent identity. These characteristics also distinguish the AMEs from the AME Church and other white Wesleyan bodies for whom maintenance of racial hegemony mattered more than black emancipationist objectives. Lastly, the AME Church, an intricate institutional entity, unlike other black religious bodies, possessed a geographic reach during its early decades that spanned the Atlantic world. A connectional presence in several areas within the Northeast and Midwest and parts of the slave South, in Haiti and Canada, and influence in Sierra Leone, due exclusively to AME co-founder Daniel Coker, extended and exposed the denomination to diverse black populations. Tensions between liberationist objectives, institution building, and spiritual faith practices similarly appeared in other black religious bodies. The longevity and territorial breadth of African Methodism, however, magnified these competing characteristics often above those in other African American churches. The AME Church, located throughout its history within the Atlantic world, faced the forces of subjugation which fixed the status of its large colored constituencies. Though AME ministers and members were themselves vulnerable peoples, they focused on the dual task of developing, next slide, and maintaining an independent religious body and confronting powerful national, political, and economic structures aimed at black subordination. While institutional governance was itself a liberationist activity, it competed and at times undermined equally important efforts to defeat oppressive systems of segregation, slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. The history of the African Methodist Episcopal Church is a narrative about these tensions. Such significant historical figures as the slave insurrectionist Denmark Vesey, the pioneering preacher Torino Lee, African church founder A.M. McConaughey, the Little Rock segregation fighter Daisy Bates, and the anti-colonial nation builder Henry Fitzroy became articulate and conscious carriers of the denomination's liberationist legacy. They demonstrated how pervasive and enduring was the insurgent impulse of African Methodism. Let me end by suggesting seven, next slide, thematic components of African Methodism that I think we ought to consider. The first is its Wesleyan identity. The second is an aegis for the Black Atlantic. The third is the emancipationist ethos. The fourth is women's empowerment. The fifth is tracking a mobile laity. The sixth is reckoning with Pentecostalism. And the seventh is tackling sexuality. Next slide. Salient in the AME narrative is the church's Wesleyan identity. An intentional linkage between spiritual, and social holiness, whether personified in Torino Lee's quest for spiritual sanctification and advocacy of liberation of abolitionism, or in Rosa Parks' sacramental holiness as a stewardess and civil rights activist. The church's Wesleyan identity. Second, next slide please. The church as an aegis for the Black Atlantic. A formative consciousness of an Atlantic constituency initially expressed in Richard Allen's dispatch of clergy to Haiti in 1824, with the consolidation of African Methodism and the Ethiopian movement in South Africa in 1896, the church beginnings in England and Brazil in 1966 and 2016, respectively. That's Bishop Henry M. Turner welcoming Reverend James Duane, whom M. McConaughey sent from South Africa to formally merge with the AME Church. Standing between Turner and Duane is Henry B. Parks, who was Secretary of Missions, and to the far right is Joseph S. Flipper, who was then pastor of Allen Temple Church in Atlanta. Both of them, Parks, there in the middle, and Flipper at the far end, are the members of that class, that Episcopal class of 1908, that spent that money for Drew. So you may want to keep that picture. Third is the emancipationist ethos. The pursuit of black freedom blended with regular church operations, whether expressed in Sarah Allen's home as a stop on the Underground Railroad, Union Bethel in Washington, D.C. as a recruiting station for black soldiers to fight in the Civil War, or Woodlawn AME Church in Chicago, which was the first headquarters for the Congress of Racial Equality. That's its pastor, Woodlawn's pastor, Archibald Carey, who invited the fledgling poor organization to set up headquarters in his church. Incidentally, his speech to the 1952 Republican National Convention became the template for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Next slide, please. Women's empowerment. Hardiness both in the full ordination of women in the ministry in 1960 and the women's election to the episcopacy in 2000. That's an ongoing issue. Number 5, tracking the mobile legacy. The way in which the AME Church's development can be understood as continuously following where its people go. Understood as tracking complicated migratory movements within the Black Atlantic, best exemplified through the rise and unification with the British Methodist Episcopal Church of Canada, whose first bishop, Willis Nasby, served simultaneously as an AME and BME bishop. 6, reckoning with Pentecostalism. Recovery, that's Jamal Bryant, speaking to his congregation of Parham Temple in Baltimore, where he seeks to combine exuberant worship with energetic social justice advocacy. And 7, I'm hurrying to a close, tackling sexuality. Emphatic declarations against homosexuality and same-sex marriage, still in AME official documents, in tension with clergy, laity, and AME scholars who advance intellectually and socially rigorous understandings of multidisciplinary findings about human sexuality. One of the AME official documents, the AME Church, through the Word of God, strongly disagreed with any theory or idea of homosexual, bisexual, and transsexual practices. Genesis 2:24 pronounces the divine union between a man and a woman. This recognizes as well the fact that God made woman for man, not man for woman. This is being contested, next slide, by a younger group of AME scholars and clergy. Why is our denomination silent to the lived reality of people whose sexual and gender non-conforming people is not heteronormative? The denominational model, which includes humankind, our family, includes all, irrespective of sexual orientation. That's from an AME pastor in South Africa. These are what I think are the salient thematic components of African Methodism, drawing both from the past and mobilized as a way in which to address the denomination's current situation. I am finished.
Well, I'm delighted to follow Professor Dickerson, and we'll see where this goes. At some point, I'd like to bring back the slide of the 7 things. Because I think that somewhere in this, we'll get to those. Sitting on the ragged edge of expectation. Recalling the time of clergy appointments at a mid-1870s session of the New Jersey Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the presiding bishop noted that though the clergy responses were, quote, of a grandeur to be appreciated, much of their force was lost, for the good appointments were so few, and the poor ones so many, that the brethren listened whilst sitting on the ragged edge of expectation. The tension inherent in the juxtaposition of the ragged edge and expectation makes this an apt metaphor for the founding and early years of the Bethel AME Methodist Church of Morristown. Indeed, when 30-year-old Frances Ray organized the Mite Society, a benevolent organization, in 1843, like the brethren at the conference, she was sitting on the ragged edge of expectation, facing few good options and many poor ones. Born in 1813, 30 years after the end of the Revolutionary War and the creation of a new nation founded on principles of equality and freedom, Frances knew what it meant to live life on the verge of. Spending the first 25 years of her life as an enslaved female in one of Morristown's leading white families, she was intimately familiar with the town's boast as the crossroads of the American Revolution and George Washington's headquarters. She was also poignantly aware of the new republic's retrenchment from the promise and expectation of freedom and equality. By the 1840s, the winds of fear and profit had all but extinguished the emancipatory flame of the revolutionary generation. Did I turn it on? Help is on the way. Thank you. White fear of a growing population of black free political actors and the profit derived from the continued enslavement and sale of men, women, and children of African descent swirled in tandem, pushing the experiment in democracy to the ragged edge as the nation careened headlong toward religious and political division and ultimately civil war. In the 1840s, as in the colonial era, slavery and bonded labor remained a central feature of the American economy and society, North and South. In a curious turn of history, the Second Great Awakening, a Presbyterian congregational schism, and the racism of Jacksonian nationalism led to the formation of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Morristown. In the 1840s, Frances Ray and the 9 women and 3 men who joined her as officers and members of the Mite Society found themselves in the vortex of religious, political, and social currents, not of their own making, but out of which they would have to find their way amid a few good and many poor options. Given 175 years of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Morristown, and Professor Dickerson's well-crafted and engaging discussion of the central themes of the AME denomination, you're probably wondering why I would choose to enter today's conversation in 1843. First, I'm intrigued by origin stories. They can be quite illuminating, providing insight into motivation and expectations. In addition, they often shed light on the vital things that matter, those values and practices
that had endured, for good or ill. Secondly, the 1840s represent an inflection point in American religious and political history and in AME history. From this vantage, we can trace the institutional trajectory and try to discern what being the church meant over time. Finally, I believe that placing Francis Ray's act of resistance in conversation with a broader historical narrative of the AME Church that Professor Dickerson shared with us today may tell us something about religion and society in our own time. Francis Ray's agency in founding a benevolent society that became an independent church for African Americans is a commentary on identity, gendered, racial, religious, and political. Confronting the loss and devastation wrought by 8 years of war fought for freedom and equality, white Northerners believed that enslaved blacks were the species of property that best ensured prosperity in the new republic. The hallmarks of modernity, industrial production, and mass consumption required cheap labor to fuel the national recovery and to secure a capitalist expansion. Consequently, the new republic soon jettisoned its ideology of human freedom and natural rights, and instead turned a deaf ear to the cries of the enslaved and did the bidding of the slavocracy. The leaders of the new republic pursued a program of economic and industrial growth, along with territorial expansion, predicated on the removal of native peoples and the commodification of black bodies. For example, while Congress attacked the African slave trade, the federal government did nothing to abolish slavery or to prohibit the interstate trafficking in human bodies, a market that effectively placed a premium on black women's productive and reproductive labor. Though the village of Morristown and the surrounding countryside had fared better than other sections during the Revolutionary War, post-war stories of suffering and, quote, impoverishment in men and money grew along with those of patriotism and sacrifice. As the colonial hamlet evolved into an upwardly mobile aristocratic village with a substantial increase in property and wealth, elite white residents came to rely more heavily on enslavement and bonded labor for economic security and social status. Iron forges and grist mills that supplied gunpowder, bread, and butter to Washington's army had to be refurbished or built anew. Large farms required a larger labor force, and manor homes owned by the growing number of industrial and manufacturing magnates, and the hotels that promised cool summers to Southern enslavers and the social elite demanded a cheap but reliable staff. Reflecting the prosperity supported by enslaved labor, white Protestant congregations moved out of the plain meeting houses in the hollow under the hill to magnificent brick and stone structures fronting the Morristown Green at the top of the hill. While neighboring New York and Pennsylvania moved slowly but deliberately toward emancipation, the status of African Americans in New Jersey remained mired in a morass of colonial-era laws based on West Indian slave codes and gradual emancipation statutes. Between 1804 and 1846, the New Jersey legislature passed laws designed to control the lives and extract as much profit as possible from the bodies of African Americans. Enacted by a state legislature that privileged private property and profit over natural and civil rights, these laws, according to one historian, freed no one but promised gradual liberty after 20-plus years of service. For 9 years after the passage of the first 1804 Gradual Emancipation Act, Frances Ray was most likely granted her freedom only 5 years before she organized the Mite Society. It is also probable that the men and women born before 1804 who joined her in the Mite Society were still slaves for life. Emancipation in Morristown was limited and sporadic. Whether enslaved for life or bound until age 25 for females and 28 for males, black children and young adults remained under the control of white enslavers. They could be given as a gift or bequeathed to heirs and relatives in a will. They could be sold to liquidate a debt or to capitalize a new commercial venture. Or they could be kidnapped and trafficked at inflated prices to enslavers in the young nation's expanding northwestern or southwestern territory. Not until 1846 did New Jersey pass an Emancipation Act. The law declared that all children born after 1846 were free. It abolished the term slave and transformed already enslaved persons to apprentices for life, without, however, conferring the rights and privileges of citizenship. Slavery in New Jersey did not legally end until ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Consequently, for African Americans, family formation remained fragile and community organization tenuous. The Bethel AME Church of Morristown was organized at these social and political crossroads. New Jersey's white Protestants compromised with and benefited from slavery's continuation. Whereas in the colonial period, Quakers had advocated against slavery and for abolition, and Presbyterians and Methodists had embraced Africans as Christian converts and members, in the post-revolutionary period, Protestant churches deemed slavery a political question and stressed that baptism and conversion did not change an enslaved person's civil status. Between 1804 and 1842, the Morristown Presbyterian Church recorded over 40 marriages of black couples and many more baptisms of enslaved children and adults. Most were sponsored by the white Presbyterians who legally claimed them as property. Even so, this limited religious ritual rarely extended beyond the enslaver's immediate household staff. The patron-client relation symbolized by this religious practice remained a salient feature of race relations in Morristown, even after African Americans formed independent churches and organizations. While the Quaker-inspired anti-slavery movement withered under the heat of American expansionist and nationalist fervor, a few white Protestants were troubled by the incompatibility of slavery with their religious beliefs, including some Morristown Presbyterians. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, while white Presbyterians comprised the most numerous Protestant group in New Jersey and the leading civic and religious leaders in Morristown and its environs. Settling first along eastern Long Island and then making their way to Newark and Morris County, these Puritan rebels from the New Haven colony initially formed congregational churches, but soon found political strength in the Presbyterian form of organization. Dating from the founding of the church in 1742, Morristown Presbyterian pastors were most often Yale College graduates and Princeton College trustees, while the membership represented the leading merchants, landowners, industrialists, and slave owners in the hamlet, and could be counted among the state's most influential political and civic leaders. More sympathetic to colonization than to anti-slavery or abolition, Morristown Presbyterians established a Sabbath school for free and enslaved blacks in the church basement and staffed with white women. Similarly, Presbyterians in Parsippany, Piscataway, New Brunswick, and Princeton opened African schools to train black missionaries for immigration to Africa in furtherance of the colonization movement. Not only did these Sabbath and Sunday schools provide a semi-public space for elite white women to exercise their charitable calling, they reinforced the notion that free and enslaved blacks needed white supervision. In 1817, white Presbyterian minister and Morris County resident Reverend Robert Finley organized the American Colonization Society and proposed the African option as the solution to America's original sin of slavery and its perpetuation. In spite of New Jersey's slow walk toward emancipation, by 1820 the state's free black population outnumbered the enslaved, though in Morris County enslavement remained the plight of the majority of African Americans. Finley and his fellow colonizations argue that the voluntary removal or self-deportation in today's parlance, of free black people of color to Africa, not Haiti or Canada, but achieved the dual benefit of encouraging manumissions and ridding the nation of the evil of a growing class of criminal, degraded, and dependent free black people. African Americans denounced the colonization society for its racism, none more strongly or consistently than the leaders of the newly formed African Methodist Episcopal denomination. Nonetheless, New Jersey's white Presbyterians, Methodists, and Episcopalians continue to support the colonization movement and its underlying racial assumptions. Sitting in Negro pews, segregated galleries on windowsills, and being the last served at the communion table typified the black worshipers' experience in most New Jersey Protestant churches. In the late 1820s and 1830s, spiritual revivalism and social reform, two currents flowing from the Second Great Awakening, converged in Morristown and swept both black and white Protestants in the vortex. The egalitarian medium of open-air revivals and protracted meetings, coupled with camp-style preaching, seemed designed to carry the message of a personal salvation equally available to all. The message and the medium ushered in a new interest in religion and a new wave of social activism. With a focus on education, women's rights, universal or non-property suffrage, and a renewed interest in abolition, social reform became spiritual work. The spirit of revival stirred religious renewal in New York City and Philadelphia, as well as Morristown. Reverend Albert Barnes, pastor of the Morristown Presbyterian Church from 1825 to 1830, turned a Methodist revival begun in a neighboring village into the Morristown Great Revival of 1827 and 28. Barnes' embrace of revivalism, perfectionism, and abolition, and rejection of a strict Calvinist doctrine of salvation portended things to come. His anti-slavery stance was unequivocal. For example, he declared, "There is no power out of the church that could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in the church." A sentence Frederick Douglass quoted in his famous 1856 4th of July oratory. Albert Barnes was Frances Ray's pastor and officiated at her marriage to James Ray in 1830. The emphasis on civic holiness stirred a renewed commitment to militant abolitionism among white Presbyterians. In the early teens, Presbyterians had been solidly in the colonization column. However, during this sacramental season of love, as they called it, Presbyterian fence-strappers, who had long debated the colonization versus abolition question, had to choose sides. By 1837, conflicting views on revivalism, salvation, and abolition led to the new school, old school schism among white Presbyterians, foreshadowing disagreements that a few years later would lead to denominational splits among Methodists and Baptists. In 1841, the religiously liberal wing of the Morristown Presbyterian Church dissented and formed the Second Presbyterian Church of Morristown, taking with them 200 members and most of the trustee board. According to one eyewitness report, party feelings ran high. By the 1820s and 1830s, a growing population of northern free blacks was intent upon ending slavery and claiming a place in the land of their birth. Among African Americans, free and enslaved, the season of spirited revivals created a theology and politics of liberation and a praxis of resistance. Independent organizations, including benevolent, mite, and literary societies, Masonic lodges, fraternal organizations, and churches proliferated, along with printed publications, pamphlets, and petitions. African Americans in white Presbyterian churches in Newark, Westfield, Patterson, and New Brunswick, for example, called for immediate emancipation in anti-colonization petitions sent to the New Jersey legislature. In Philadelphia, 3,000 African Americans attended a protest meeting at Richard Allen's Bethel AME Church in 1830 and declared that the colonization scheme violated professed American principles. In the midst of a racist slave regime, African Americans used various strategies and tactics to both define freedom and forge a shared identity. In a real sense then, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church of Morristown arose out of the contradictions and conflict among white Protestants. Frances Ray and her Mite Society were sitting on that ragged edge of expectation, ready to claim their own religious space and racial identity. By the 1840s, the African Methodist Episcopal Church was in expansion mode, and Northern free blacks were poised for change. AME conferences received more requests than could be fulfilled from benevolent and Mite societies, formed by a Christian female requesting a minister, and from prayer bands meeting in different women's houses asking that a male member be ordained as a deacon. Each request, as Professor Dickerson argued, was an act of self-determination, a step toward racial consciousness, religious independence, or political freedom, and a desire to connect the church that stood against the twin evils of slavery and racial discrimination. Yet, each request had to be weighed against the safety of the prospective appointee and the African Methodist Episcopal brand. The decision often rested on the requester's ability to support a minister. Men who undertook the work of expanding the denomination did so at great personal cost, financial as well as physical. Their safety in traveling to different locations on the circuit by foot, horseback, barge, or train could not be taken for granted. Neither could securing, in Bishop Payne's words, the confidence of the white community. The threat of free men being kidnapped and sold or attacked as abolitionists was always present. Presiding bishops and elders understood all too well what was at stake. The anti-slavery and civil rights militancy born of a belief in personal and civic salvation intensified throughout the 1840s, and so did the white backlash. Perhaps not coincidentally, the style and rhetoric of Jacksonian democracy in the political realm were similarities to the egalitarian message in the spiritual realm. The watchwords universal salvation and universal suffrage share a sonic kinship. The one resonated with racism and white mobs, and the other presented the perfectibility of the individual in society as imminently possible. In what historian Gary Nash calls the cruel double paradox of racial discrimination, the more free blacks achieved in building churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, the more white people resented them. Racism and the elevation of the real working man fueled Jacksonian nationalism and led to race riots, arson, and death in northern cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Newark. While in Princeton, white rowdies, intent on stopping the colored people from worshiping in their church, targeted African Methodist Episcopal churches and meeting houses. Between 1848 and 1851, 20% of parishioners in New Jersey and New York churches took the African option and immigrated. Many more, like Frances Ray, and the women and men who organized and sustained a Mite Society in Morristown that became the African Methodist Episcopal Church, remained and developed strategies, as Professor Dickerson stated, from among competing tendencies to resist those who would mediate black freedom. The grandeur of the struggle and its successes may not always be apparent, for often we too are listening while sitting on the ragged edge of expectation. One reason I'd like that slide, if possible, of the 7. So I'd like you to look at it again, and I hope that somewhere in this you've heard some of those same struggles that Professor Dickerson talked about in terms of the AME Church's themes were present from the very beginning. Imagine women and men, some free, some enslaved, sitting in Morristown. That's okay, oh, that's the one, good. Imagine men and women, free and enslaved, sitting in Morristown, deciding that they were, although they had been baptized and were communicants in the white Presbyterian Church, that denomination no longer met their needs as people, as religious beings, as mothers, fathers, and families. And on their own to make the decision to form a church. And that was only the first step, the preparatory step. Gaining the recognition from Richard Allen's AME Church was often as difficult as that initial step. But as I said, it was part of that protecting the brand and making sure that the ministers, that structure, could be supported and sustained. And today we are still sitting on the edge of expectation, with poor choices as well as good choices before us. Thank you.
Wow, I think I have had an entire semester of AME history, but it is a glorious one, which I'm sure inspires questions from our audience for both Dr. Dickerson and Dr. Adams. Questions for either of them about this larger picture of the evolution of AMEs, both in the United States but then globally, and then the particular evolution out of the Presbyterian Church in Morristown and the White Society that created AME.
I know historians hate to be asked questions about current events. Since they're historians, but I'm going to ask this question anyway. Given that we appear to be living, I would say it's factual, in a time of more overt racism in our country, certainly in terms of voter suppression. I think that's absolutely factual. Talking about being on the edge, where do you see the AME Church on that balance beam between personal holiness, social activism? Where is it now? Where's that tension? Where's that struggle going on? And if you even want to venture, where do you think it ought to go? Thank you.
Are you asking, I hate to answer a question with another question, are you asking whether that tendency toward spiritually based, salvifically based insurgency is still alive and well? Is that what you're asking?
Is it alive and well, and where?
No.
Is it moving more towards social activism, or is it moving more towards...
I don't think it's alive and well. I think that one of the concerns I have, not just about the AME Church, but about black churches in particular, and white churches as well, is that we, over time, we can get into a long discussion about the causality and the specific developments. We've divorced a sense that our interior spiritual life is divorced from our public witness. And AMEs aren't immune to that. And we all live in the same society. We're all subject to the same popular culture forces. AMEs aren't a special breed of people, a special breed of humanity. They're subject, like others, to being lulled to sleep by prosperity and progress, etc. What I'm suggesting is that there is a tradition, there is a history that is available for recovery. How we navigate or how we recovering that very palpable tradition that's I think, in many ways, very easily articulated and very easily retrieved is a matter for the church's current ministry and membership. Perhaps, if I can prognosticate a little, if perhaps the current situation that the nation is in might be just a spur to cause sensible and serious church people to see what they have available to them in their own tradition to the impulse of insurgency that forbears under more daunting circumstances than what we confront today, had the courage to mobilize. Is that responsive to?
Yes.
I think I may have a different take on that. I'm not Methodist, I should let you know right up front. However, in looking at Frances Ray and thinking about her, meditating on her in that Mite Society, I was so struck by parallels with our contemporary situation. If you recall the young woman who climbed up the pole in Charleston a couple of years ago, she was an AME daughter. And she went, and that to me was part of that somewhere. She may not have been thinking of AME theology, but she was thinking of the praxis. And sometimes I think we are almost like the Alanites in the beginning in our churches. We are so careful of protecting the brand that we aren't quite seeing the spiritual, salvific, social justice work that's being done in the community. And when these requests come and they're knocking on our doors, we have to pause and say, wait a minute, who are you? Where are you? What's going on? I think there is more out there. And that part of our job may be to take what we know and share that and connect it the way Nasri, the first pastor, who was from a different denomination, welcomed into the congregation, and within a couple of years became a bishop, because he was riding that circuit, talking to groups of people, and saying, I hear what you're saying, and here's the AME Church to do it. And maybe that's just a little too aspirational on my side, but I think the ingredients are there.
Other questions? Yes.
For Dr. Dickerson, Dennis, I'm particularly referencing your seventh point about the AME Church tackling homosexuality. And I'm referencing my experience as the pastor at historic St. George's in Philadelphia and welcoming United Methodist and AME congregation groups and new member groups and tourists and visitors, and telling them the story about what happened at historic St. George's when Richard Allen and Absalom Jones left and were rather violently forced from the balcony. And with every tour group, I or other docents ask the question, who is the church today? And I'll say whether United Methodist or AME or other denominations, putting in the balcony today. And wondering myself, and actually seeing the light bulbs go off among people that we had on the tours, that maybe LGBTQI people were people who were being forced into the balcony today. Is that a fair, sort of reading of the history, or a fair assessment of the struggle that we're in, or am I misusing that story? I'm thinking about how wonderfully articulate you are about the emancipatory spirit that runs through the veins of the AME Church. Am I, or were we at St. George's on target by trying to make that leap, or were we off target?
I wish I had. I wish I had space on the slide to put the full comment from Reverend Voss, the South African pastor, very young South African pastor, who the theme of that particular article, from which I just drew just a snippet from, it was examining the church's motto: God our Father, Christ our Redeemer. It used to be mankind, our brother, but we've expanded that to humankind, our family. How inclusive do we intend for that to be? Now, that was a real challenge. And it is that inclusive of persons who are not heteronormative. I'm learning a whole lot of new terminology. And that's the challenge. The church documents, as I mentioned, say one thing, that the church stands against homosexuality, same-sex marriage, etc. But there's a different reality being explored by younger clergy, younger lay people, younger scholars of AME background, taking into account the fact that we know a great deal more about human sexuality from psychological, biological, other disciplines that really challenge the rather binary view that we have about human sexual behavior and human sexual identity. The church is challenged to look at humanity as God has made humanity, and accommodating its posture, its stances, its creeds to that reality. The challenge for the AME Church is that its liberation, its emancipationist ethos, is that inclusive or is it particular? Is it just particular on the matter of race, or is it inclusive on a matter of a whole host of categories and a whole host of barriers that we human beings have erected against each other? That's the debate the church still has to have. And our current documents don't reflect that debate. And that's the next stage. I think, to answer your question specifically, exactly what you said is exactly language that ought to be posed as the key question that has to be worked out by the church. Everyone has those challenges in your family. Everybody here. And I remember in my family when that challenge was asserted itself, the question became quite simple for me: do we want this family member to be at Thanksgiving dinner or not? And I say, yeah, we want the whole family here for Thanksgiving. And so you make your adjustments, incremental though they may be, based on that, not on a principle, not on a creed, but on the matter of love for your family member. And then you make and you take it from there. The church, the AME Church, still has to go. You guys, United Methodist, you are racking yourselves to death. I live in Nashville. And it might be different in New Jersey, where there's a greater, a more vigorous discourse. But in Nashville, among the United Methodists whom I see, I just want to say hello and get out of there before getting drawn into their discourse. And so the AME Church is not yet had its real day of reckoning on that in the same way that you all are right now. And I hope we can be led and educated by the way in which you're handling it as well. This is one man's opinion.
So there is one in the back. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Janelle Green, class of 2017 December. And
Congratulations.
my question is directed to Dr. Davidson. Can you please speak about the political side of what is part of our DNA, and particularly whether or not it also encompasses bipartisanship? What's the history around that? Or have we always been one-sided towards the movement? Of course, the party of Lincoln was Republicans. When did we make that transition in terms of collectively fighting, advancing towards equality? Or has it always been something where we recognize as a denomination the need to try to address issues from both sides of the aisle, so to speak? You understand what my question is?
Are you asking, has the AME Church always been a partisan organization for one or the other?
In our pursuit of justice.
In our pursuit of justice. You know, the AME Church, in my opinion, has been rather pragmatic. My father was a Republican. You know, was a Republican Party committeeman in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. In 1964, the Republicans nominated Goldwater. My father said, "I'll see you later." That's a bridge too far. And he was a good AME layman. I think it's been practical. At that point, in where we live in Western Pennsylvania, the Republicans were much better on civil rights matters than Democrats, and so he became a Republican. When that changed, he changed, and I think that those sorts of pragmatic choices have been made by AMEs everywhere. Roger O'Carroll, whom I showed, he was a Republican, and was asked to give that speech at the GFP convention in 1952 because he was one of the few Republicans, black or white, in Cook County, Illinois. Just as the Dailies were really activating their very powerful and influential political machine. Again, 1954, when Republicans nominated Goldwater, he left. And so blacks have made those kinds of pragmatic choices. Earlier in the 20th century, don't get me started, early in the 20th century, a number of leading AME clergy and lay people were looking at the socialists very carefully. Your very venerable Bishop Reverend C. Ransom said, well, Jesus did say the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, and he said that there are some socialist principles that we ought to think about. So nuts to the Republicans, nuts to the Democrats, let's look at the socialists. So we've had a history of making those sort of pragmatic calculations that which political party was best equipped to advance the emancipationist agenda that AME clergy and laity envisage for their communities. I hope that's responsive.
It is. Because I find that for today, I think we have to be conversant on both sides of the aisle if we are trying to affect anything. It's important to have a mass movement, but at the same time, I think there's an importance to being able to talk to both sides of the aisle, even if we don't agree.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Thank you.
I agree.
And most people don't know this pragmatic history, especially coming out of the Civil War into Reconstruction, the Party of Lincoln, and then also how it evolves with the Great Migration North, which creates a completely different voting context in those urban cities such as Chicago versus the continuation of mass disenfranchisement in the South. And even when you have the evolution of voting rights, there's still a period of that Southern Democrat that continues in places like where I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, where you did not vote for those Southern Democrats. I think maybe Jimmy Carter may have been part of a shift for us locally, but there was still there was very much a distancing from the party that continue to uphold Jim Crow segregation, to defy the 54 decision, etc. So its location and also the practicality of location and national and local may be a completely different story, right?
If I could just add one thing about that. What I found very appealing and compelling about the AME Church is that it took people who had been baptized in the Presbyterian Church, baptized in no church, living in very different places, and saying, if you want to somehow combine your civic responsibility and your spiritual welfare, this is the place to do it. So I think that is part of that DNA of the AME Church that says, if social justice is important to you and your spiritual salvation, personal salvation, you may find a home here. You may not stay, but you'll find a home along.
Yes. There are, I think, two. Did you have a question also?
I do.
We'll take you next.
I'm Matthew, and I'm from Liberia, and second year student, theological student from Drew University here. I heard this first speaker talk about my country, Liberia, where the AME Church is really making some impact. And he also said about slavery made the church break away from the Methodist Church. The black were hated and then mistreated, made them to leave. But with these churches, both the Methodist Church, the AME Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the Baptist Church went to my country. They exhibited the same attitude. No black men, no white men were there. There was no white. They carried the church to us. But they saw the indigenous people as naked, as good for nothing, and they suppressed them. Anyway, to live within them, they would change your name. If your name was Jacaro, they give you a Johnson, they give you a Princeton, they give you a James. So you go to Liberia, all of us who want education, especially those who got it in the 60s and the 50s, you got to be a Johnson, you got to be a rabbi, you got to be Peter. So, why? Isn't that a form of slavery being done by our people who supposed to help us get liberation? I started.
Yes. Oh. Yes, Dr. Dickerson is saying that in fact, what we historians will sometimes describe it as the Americo-Liberian colonization, that they were colonists in exactly the way you described, and regarding, in using the pejorative words of Africans as heathen and backwards and civilized, and part of the civilizing mission of uplift was in fact to acculturate Africans to be Europeanized, right? And I think what Dr. Dickerson was saying, and you're saying as well, is those kinds of constructions of hierarchy, right, that black people aren't immune to those constructions at all. And this is just one example. And we could give others, even domestic ones, internal to the United States, with a notion of uplift by a African-American elites to the working class, right? So we could have that discussion as well. But you are correct, and we're in total agreement for that history.
Yeah. Yes, and the only thing I would add in terms of other examples, you're saying domestic examples, certainly when it comes to women in the clergy, that is a clear example. Many of the societies and groups that were petitioning the AME Church in the formative years to become part of the connection were places led by women. And the church responded, you cannot be a part of our connection until we can find a suitable man to send to that place. So often you see in the histories of these churches a date of organization and the date when they became a formally recognized AME Church, and sometimes it's a matter of years. So that same patriarchal hierarchy was prevalent from its beginning, so I guess that's part of the DNA as well.
If you call up the slide again, can you do that?
Oh, the slide.
I want to buttress your point. Let's see. Keep going back. Keep going back. Keep going back. No, keep going back. Go back. No, get there. Charlotte Montier and your Randall, they started the church in those respective countries. I mean, this is to your point. This is not only true in the United States, this is also true in Africa. We usually credit M.M. Macombie in South Africa and James. Let me see. Well, I won't have you go back to another. We have Turner shaking the hands of James Duane. She's the one that started the church in South Africa, Charlotte Montier. The church in Ghana was started by Karoka Randall, who migrated from Sierra Leone to Ghana. That's to your point. That's part of the historical reality that hasn't translated into the way in which we articulate and how we write the narrative. The church starts, in Dr. Adams' description, the church started when the man became the pastor, not when the founding organization was inaugurated. And so you really need to, this is a good opportunity. I see Bethel Church, Morristown is starting that, rewriting that narrative, because most of our local church narrative, the church that I attend in Nashville, was started by Ellen Calhoun, an ex-slave woman in Nashville. That's who started the church. We then got a pastor. But happily in our narrative, it's Ellen Calhoun, and met, 13 people met in her house. And out of that came a Greater Bethel, actually it was first named Liberty Chapel. That's how that church began. But that is not yet fully integrated into the normative narrative that we usually articulate.
Dr. Davis, I believe you're next.
Sorry, logistics. Thank you both again for such great presentations. One little thing that is not a new theme in history, particularly the history of race in America, is the problem of assigning agency. And I heard in both presentations one very minor difference in the way that famous stories are told versus the way primarily white people like to have them told. I teach a lot of white people history they don't like to hear. And usually, for instance, the story of Richard Allen is they were forcibly kicked out of St. George's. What I heard you say today was, they said, enough of this, we're going to go do Methodism the way it's supposed to be done, which is a very different story than we got kicked out. The interesting thing about the way most white Methodists tell that story is it allows them to say, we sure are sorry that those people in the past did that. They were wrong people of their time, and we would never do such a thing. It's very different for you to claim, well, we've got real Methodism. You guys really messed it up. And we actually have the true version of what it means to talk about social holiness or scriptural holiness. That's a very different thing to say we're carrying what John Wesley and the other Methodists of the 18th century British movement intended. We are carrying the true version. We left you and your ruined version behind. That changes the contemporary conversation drastically. And I thought the same thing with the Francis Ray story, which is they didn't just leave the Presbyterian Church in Morristown and go start Presbyterian Second, down the street. They went, oh no, this actually is better than what we had. We're moving towards something rather than just running away from people who are not being nice to us or not treating us appropriately. Those kinds of agency differences in the way we narrate it are really important. And so I thank you for that. It's a different way for white, particularly United Methodists, maybe to hear that maybe they're not the people who inherit Wesley's heritage, even though they're bigger or whatever.
We will accept that.
Wait, what did you say?
We will accept that analysis.
You're going to let it stand, that's it?
History speaks for itself.
Corey and I, we've had this conversation, I've also had this conversation with Dr. Ritchie, that I actually would date the origins of African Methodism in 1784 at the Christmas conference, where Richard Allen and Harry Hoosier were there, and Allen remarked about the Christmas conference that, and I'm trying to recover the exact quote, and I won't be able to do it until I'm driving back to my destination, but he said, the thing that Allen noticed is that at that conference, that's the beginning of the formal organization of Methodism in America, that the clergy thought themselves entitled to the gown. And he said that was the start of the Anglican Church in America, among the Methodists. Now, what Allen was saying is that the Methodists were getting away from what he understood. Remember, he's converted in a camp meeting and by traveling evangelists, Freeborn Garrison and others. And this formality that he observed at the Christmas conference in Baltimore was not his understanding of Methodism. So he already had a sense of discomfiture even before the St. George incident. Now, a number of historians want to argue about whether it was 1787 or 1792, and so we won't get into that. I have my own analysis of that, which I won't bore you with. But that's not even the crucial question, to your point, Maury. It's what did Allen envisage about what Methodism in America ought to be? And he started that questioning. He expressed those doubts long before the St. George incident. And so he said, I think I have a better idea of what Methodism ought to be, and it's called African Methodism.
I would like to thank all of you for these phenomenal questions that elevate so many of the questions we still have today, right? And is there one more?
Just one.
Just one.
Praise the Lord. My name is Teresa Rushdan, and I'm the class of 2001 here at Drew. Amen. Amen. And I'm the pastor of Bethel AME Church right here in Madison. The reason I'm standing is the word connection. We are a connectional church. And when I see the good work of the people of Bethel Morristown, I hear connection. Because Bethel Madison is a missionary church that came out of Bethel Morristown. And I think that while this celebration is all about this amazing, significant work that Morristown has done, while we're here in Madison, the pride just goes so high because we're them and they're us. And so, because we're a connectional church, I want to say to Pastor Sidney, my colleague, Dr. Sidney, he has done a marvelous job connecting the dots and really giving us an opportunity to see our history in such a beautiful and truthful light. And the pride that some of the members of my church, just a few that work here, that we feel in being associated with the church where our first pastor came out of Bethel Morristown, Dr. Diggs. And we, as the longest standing female pastor, I believe in the New Jersey State Conference, 17 years in a mission church, I'm grateful because I came through Drew. I'm looking at Pastor Sidney and I see connection. It's not about age and how long someone's been here, or where they come from, or where they started, or if they were oppressed, and hopefully not oppressing others. But it's the fact, because oppress people often, that we're all here together, and this sense of pride is bursting forward as men and women, and our diversity, and we're just saying congratulations. So it's not so much about a question. It's about a sister saying thank you for moving us even further forward, Sydney, and just doing an incredible job. Just an incredible job. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We should have known that the preacher would have the amen, that would have the amen statement at the end of our gathering. Let's have another round of applause for Dr. Dickinson and Dr. Williams. We are, I believe, set up with Dr. Adams and Dr. Dickerson's books, which can be signed and purchased. We also have refreshments for you, and I wanted to correct the time that the concert will begin. It actually begins at 6. All right, so you have plenty of time to go over to the Dorothy Young Hall, where the Low Country Gospel concert will begin at 6. Thank you so very much for being here. So,
That's very